The air inside the waiting room was thick with the smell of floor wax and old dust, mingled with the sharp scent of nervous sweat. 10-year-old Elias sat on a folding metal chair, his legs swinging just a few inches above the ground. He held a folder against his chest, gripping it so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The folder was old, the corners bent, and the edges fraying. But to him, it was the most important thing in the world. Inside were sheets of music that he had looked at every single night for the past 3 years. Around him, the room was buzzing with noise. It wasn't a loud, chaotic noise, but a steady hum of instruments being tuned. To his left, a girl in a velvet dress was sawing away at a cello, making deep groaning sounds. To his right, a boy with shiny shoes was tapping his trumpet valves, clicking them like a fast-paced clock. Everyone seemed to know exactly what they were doing. They carried their instruments like they were extensions of their own bodies. They walked with their heads high. They belonged here. Elias pulled his sleeves down over his hands. He felt very small. His blazer was a dark blue, hand-me-down from an older cousin, and it was a little too big in the shoulders. The sleeves were slightly too short, exposing his bony wrists. He looked around at the other children. Their shoes were polished and new. They had expensive cases for their instruments. They were talking about summer camps and private tutors. Elias just looked at the floor. He thought about the morning. He remembered his mother counting out crumpled dollar bills at the kitchen table just to pay for the bus fare to get here. She had worked extra shifts at the diner all month, coming home with her feet aching and smelling of fried food, just to save up the audition fee. She had smiled at him when she handed him the envelope, her eyes tired but bright. "You are going to play beautifully, Elias," she had told him. "Just play like you do at home." He wished she could have come inside with him, but parents weren't allowed in the waiting area. She was outside, probably sitting on a concrete bench, waiting to see if her sacrifice was worth it. The weight of that sat heavy on his stomach. He couldn't mess this up. He just couldn't. The door to the inner hall opened. It wasn't a heavy door, just a simple one with a small glass window, but it felt like the entrance to a different world. A stern-looking woman with a clipboard stepped out. "Elias?" she called out, looking around the room. Elias stood up. His legs felt shaky, like jelly. He swallowed hard, trying to wet his dry throat. "I'm here," he squeaked. His voice sounded small and thin. The woman nodded, not unkindly, but she didn't smile. "Come on in. You're next." Elias walked toward the door. He felt the eyes of the other kids on him. The girl with the cello stopped playing. The boy with the trumpet looked up. He felt like he was walking onto a stage before the music even started. He took a deep breath, pushed his glasses up his nose, and walked through the doorway. The hallway was long and lined with photos of past students who had won awards. He didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on his sneakers. They were clean, but they were old, and the rubber soles were worn smooth on one side. As he walked, he could hear his own heartbeat. Thump, thump. It was louder than the cello, louder than the trumpet. They reached another door, this one leading to the main rehearsal hall. The woman opened it and gestured for him to go in. The room was huge. The ceiling was very high, and the walls were covered in soundproofing tiles that looked like beige foam. In the center of the room sat a sleek, black grand piano. It looked majestic, like a sleeping beast made of ebony and ivory. It was much bigger than the upright piano he had at home. Behind a long table sat 3 judges. In the middle was Professor Sterling. He was an older man with silver hair and sharp features. He was shuffling through a stack of papers, looking annoyed. He didn't look up when Elias entered. To the left was a younger woman, looking bored as she chewed on the end of a pen. To the right was a man with a beard who was checking his watch. Professor Sterling barked without looking up. "Elias, sir," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Instrument?" Sterling asked, still looking at his papers. "Piano, sir?" Finally, Sterling looked up. He squinted his eyes at Elias. He looked at the boy's messy hair, the glasses that were slightly too big, the worn-out sneakers, and the oversized blazer. Sterling let out a long sigh that sounded like a balloon deflating. He leaned back in his chair and tossed his pen onto the table. "Go ahead," Sterling said, waving his hand in a circle. You know what to do. Don't waste our time. Elias walked toward the piano. The floor was linoleum, and his sneakers made a high-pitched squeak with every step. It was the only sound in the massive room. Squeak, squeak, squeak. It felt like a spotlight was following him, highlighting every imperfection. He reached the piano bench. It was black leather and looked very cold. Elias sat down and realized his feet didn't quite touch the floor. He hated that. It made him feel like a toddler instead of a musician. He shuffled forward, trying to get comfortable, trying to find a position where he could reach the pedals. He opened his folder. His hands were sweating now and his fingers were damp. He tried to pull the sheets of music out, but they were stuck together. He tugged a little too hard. The papers flew out of his hands. One sheet floated to the floor, under the piano. The other slid off the music rack and landed halfway down the keyboard. Elias gasped. He reached out to grab the paper, knocking his glasses askew in the process. He quickly pushed them back up, then scrambled to lean over and pick up the sheet that had fallen on the keys. He felt his face getting hot. A red blush was crawling up his neck and onto his cheeks. The silence in the room was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was Elias's ragged breathing as he tried to gather the fallen papers. From the judge's table, he heard a sound. A low, dark chuckle. Elias looked up. Professor Sterling was staring right at him. The older man leaned toward the woman judge next to him and cupped his hand near his mouth, but he didn't whisper quietly enough. "This kid can't play," Sterling sneered, his voice cutting through the quiet air. He leaned back, a nasty smirk spreading across his face. "Look at him. He can't even hold his papers together. Save us the time, son. Go back to the playground. This is a program for musicians, not hobbyists." The words hit Elias like a physical slap. He sat there on the bench, his hands hovering over the fallen sheet music, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt a hot sting behind his eyes, the beginning of tears. He wanted to run. He wanted to pick up his folder, run out the squeaky door, find his mother, and go back to their small apartment where it was safe. The other judge. The woman looked down at her notebook, pretending to write something. The man with the beard just looked out the window. They weren't going to stop Sterling. They weren't going to help him. Elias looked down at the black and white keys. They looked cold and unforgiving. He thought about his mother counting those dollars. He thought about the nights he spent practicing on the keyboard with no sound, just pressing the keys in silence so he wouldn't wake the neighbors. He thought about how much he wanted this, not just for himself, but to show her that her hard work meant something. His hands were shaking, hovering over the keys. The sheet music was still a mess. The director was still smirking. The room felt hostile, like the air itself was pushing him away. But Elias didn't move. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He blinked his eyes rapidly, forcing the tears back down. He looked at the mess of papers, then up at the director. For a second, time seemed to stop. The smirk on Sterling's face faltered just a fraction, confused why the boy hadn't run away yet. Elias slowly pulled his hands back into his lap. He didn't reach for the music. He didn't fix his glasses. He just sat there, his small hands clasping together, gathering every bit of courage he had left in his small, tired body. The air in the hall was silent, waiting. The silence that followed the director's cruel words was heavy, pressing down on Elias like a thick wool blanket. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was an awkward, painful quiet that made his ears ring. He sat frozen on the cold leather bench, his hands still resting in his lap, afraid to move. His heart was beating so fast he could feel it thumping against his ribs. Like a trapped bird trying to break out of a cage, Elias looked at the sheet music scattered across the keys and the floor. One page was lying sideways, caught between the black keys of the piano. If he reached for it, his hands would shake and he would drop it again. If he tried to put them back in order, the judges would see how clumsy he was. He felt a hot flush of embarrassment crawl up his neck again. It felt like his skin was on fire. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to sink right through the floorboards and vanish. Professor Sterling didn't look away. He leaned his elbow on the table, resting his chin on his hand, watching Elias with a look of bored amusement. The older man tapped his fingers on the table, a rhythmic sound that seemed to mock the boy. Sterling had seen hundreds of kids like this before, or at least he thought he had. Kids who didn't have the training, who didn't have the right clothes, who didn't have the look of a prodigy. To him, this was just another wasted 5 minutes in his very busy day. "Come now, we haven't got all day," Sterling said, his voice sharp and impatient. "Pick up your things and go." "There are others waiting." The woman judge next to him sighed softly, flipping a page in her notebook without looking up. She seemed used to this. She seemed to want it to be over. Elias gripped the edge of the piano bench. The hard wood dug into his palms. He looked toward the back of the room, where the auditorium doors were closed. He knew his mother was on the other side of those doors, probably pacing back and forth, wondering what was happening. He imagined her face when he walked out. She would be smiling, expecting him to tell her it went well. How could he tell her that the director had laughed at him? How could he tell her that he had run away with his tail between his legs? He thought about the piano at home. It was an old upright that had seen better days. Some of the keys stuck when you pressed them, and it had a wobbly leg that his dad had fixed with a stack of coasters years ago. But every night, after his mom came home from the diner, exhausted and smelling of grease, Elias would play. He would play softly, gentle melodies that made her close her eyes and hum along. It was the only time the house felt peaceful. It was the only time he felt like he was good at something. That piano wasn't fancy. It wasn't a shiny grand like this one. But it was his. Elias looked down at his hands. They were small, with short fingers and chewed fingernails. They didn't look like the hands of a master pianist. But he knew these hands. He knew exactly how much pressure it took to press a key to make it sing, and how much pressure would make it shout slowly. Very slowly, Elias stopped looking at the floor. He lifted his head. He didn't look at the director. He didn't look at the judges. He looked straight ahead at the music rack, which was now empty. He didn't need the paper. He knew the music. He knew it better than he knew his own name. Professor Sterling raised an eyebrow. He waited for the boy to stand up. He waited for the tears to start. But the boy just sat there. Something was changing. The boy's shoulders, which had been slumped forward in defeat, began to straighten. The rigid, tense look on his face softened, replaced by something else. It wasn't a smile. It was a look of intense focus. Sterling shifted in his chair. He felt a strange prickle of unease, but he ignored it. He crossed his arms over his chest, determined to wait the boy out. "I said," Sterling repeated, his voice dropping to a growl. "You may leave." Elias took a deep breath. He filled his lungs with the dusty air of the auditorium. He closed his eyes for just a moment. He tuned out the sound of the fluorescent lights humming above him. He tuned out the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. He tuned out the sound of his own fear. In his mind, he was back in his living room. The lights were dim. His mom was sitting in her favorite armchair, her eyes closed. It was just him and the music. When he opened his eyes again, they were clear. The fear was gone. He wasn't a nervous kid in a too-big blazer anymore. He was a musician. He didn't reach for the fallen sheet music. Instead, Elias lifted his hands and placed them gently on the keys. He didn't strike them. He didn't bang on them. He rested his fingertips on the ivory, feeling the smooth, cool surface. He placed his right thumb on the E key and his left pinky on the low C. "What are you doing?" Sterling snapped, sitting up straighter. The amusement was gone from his voice, replaced by annoyance. Elias ignored him. He flexed his fingers, feeling the tension in his knuckles melt away. He adjusted his posture. He sat up tall, his feet firmly planted even, if they didn't touch the floor. He centered himself. The judges were confused. The woman stopped writing. The man with the beard stopped looking at his watch. They stared at the boy. They expected him to cry. They expected him to apologize. But he didn't. He just sat there, calm as a stone statue, with his hands resting on the piano. The air in the room seemed to change. It was electric now. It was the feeling you get just before a storm breaks, or just before a light switch is flipped. The mockery that had filled the room just moments ago had evaporated. Now there was only curiosity and a lingering tension. Sterling leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand that the boy leave the stage immediately. But before he could make a sound, Elias moved. It wasn't a sudden movement. It was slow and deliberate. Elias took a breath, held it for a second, then let it out as his right hand pressed down on the first chord. But he didn't play the music that was on the floor. He didn't play Clair de Lune. He started playing something else. He started playing a simple, sad melody that he had written himself late one night when he couldn't sleep. It was a song that started low and quiet, like a whisper in the dark. The sound that came out of the grand piano was not what anyone expected. It wasn't the clumsy banging of a beginner. It was a sound that was rich and full. It was a sound that resonated through the floorboards and vibrated in the soles of the judge's shoes. Sterling's mouth snapped shut. The insult he was about to say died on his lips. His eyes widened slightly behind his glasses. He looked at the boy's hands, watching the fingers dance across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible. Elias didn't look at them. He closed his eyes again, surrendering to the music. He played the notes he knew so well, the notes that lived in his heart. He played for the late nights. He played for the tired mother. He played to prove that he existed, that he mattered, that he was there. The skepticism in the room began to crack like thin ice. The woman judge lifted her pen, poised to write a negative comment, but her hand hovered in the air. She didn't write anything. She just listened. The sound was coming from the hands of a child, but it carried the weight of an adult's soul. It was a sound that demanded to be heard. Elias pressed the pedal with his foot, stretching his leg as far as he could. The sound swelled, filling the high ceiling of the hall. It washed over the director, over the table, over the empty chairs. It was a sound that said, "I am not leaving." It was a sound that said, "Listen to me." The smirk was long gone from Sterling's face. He sat perfectly still, his arms uncrossing slowly and falling to his sides. He watched Elias with a gaze that was no longer dismissive. It was the gaze of a man who realizes he has made a terrible mistake. Elias continued to play. Lost in the world of sound he had created, unaware that the power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. He wasn't asking for permission anymore. He was taking it. The sound that floated from the piano didn't just fill the room. It seemed to change the very air inside it. It started as a soft, humbling melody, the kind that makes you want to hold your breath so you don't miss a single note. The acoustics of the large hall caught the music, lifting it up toward the high ceiling where the dust motes danced in the light. It was a sound so pure and clear that it felt like the silence before the music had been a lie. For the first few seconds, the man with the beard stopped looking at his watch completely. His hand froze in midair, then slowly lowered to the table. The woman with the pen stopped chewing on it. She turned her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as if she were trying to solve a puzzle. Where was this coming from? Just moments ago, this boy looked like he was about to fall apart. Now his hands were moving with a purpose that was scary to watch. Professor Sterling was the most affected. The smirk had vanished from his face so quickly, it was as if someone had wiped it off with a cloth. He leaned forward, his elbows hitting the table with a thud he didn't even notice. He wasn't looking at the boy's clothes anymore. He wasn't looking at the messy hair or the oversized blazer. His eyes were locked on Elias's hands. It was impossible. Sterling had seen thousands of auditions. He knew what a beginner sounded like. Beginners hit the keys too hard. They rush. They hesitate. They stutter. Elias was doing none of those things. His fingers were caressing the keys, not striking them. He was playing with a gentleness that made the grand piano sing in a way Sterling hadn't heard in years. Elias was not thinking about the judges. He wasn't thinking about the director or the other students waiting in the hall. In his mind, he was far away from this cold, bright room. He was back in his small living room. The walls there were painted a soft yellow, but the paint was peeling in the corners. There was a worn rug on the floor, and the smell of his mother's stew often hung in the air. He remembered the day his father brought the old piano home. It wasn't this shiny black monster. It was a small, brown, upright, that had seen better days. It smelled like old wood and vanilla. His father had told him, "Music is a language, Elias. If you learn to speak it, you will never be alone." His father was gone now, but the piano remained. Elias played the notes that his father used to hum. It was a simple folk song, but Elias had changed it. He had added his own feelings to it over the years. When he felt sad, the song played slower. When he felt happy, the notes jumped. Today, he poured all his anxiety into the keys, and the music came out deep and resonant, like a river flowing over smooth stones. The melody shifted. The slow, sad beginning started to climb. It grew stronger. The notes became brighter, weaving together a complex tapestry of sound. Elias's left hand was keeping a steady heartbeat rhythm on the lower keys. While his right hand danced like a bird on the high notes, the physical effort of playing took over Elias's body. The shivering in his legs stopped. He stopped pulling at his sleeves. He sat upright, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm. He was completely in control. Every muscle in his hands knew exactly where to go. It was like his fingers had a brain of their own. He didn't need to look at the keys. He didn't need to look at the music on the floor. He knew exactly where every note lived. The woman judge leaned over to the man with the beard. "He's not reading the music," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the piano. "He's playing from memory." The man nodded slowly, his eyes wide. "That's not just memory," he whispered back. "That's instinct." Professor Sterling heard them, but he didn't say a word. He just rubbed his chin, his face stern but his eyes betraying a shock he couldn't hide. He realized with a sinking feeling in his stomach that he had judged a book by its cover, and he had been wrong. Terribly wrong. The music swelled again, filling every corner of the vast hall. It bounced off the soundproof tiles and echoed back to them. It was a beautiful, haunting sound that seemed to touch everyone in the room differently. For the woman judge, it reminded her of walking through a forest in the autumn. For the man with the beard, it reminded him of his childhood home. For Sterling, it was a slap in the face. He saw the arrogance of his own behavior reflected in the music. Here was a boy with nothing, no expensive training, no fancy suit, no connections, yet he had something that Sterling couldn't teach. He had soul. Elias's fingers moved faster now. The music was becoming more intense, like a storm gathering strength. The chords were thicker, richer. He was using the pedals now, his legs stretching to reach them, dampening the sound to make it soft and watery, then releasing it to let the sound ring out like a bell. The contrast was breathtaking. The room was completely under his spell. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to disappear. The ticking clock was forgotten. The only thing that mattered was the sound coming from the boy at the piano. Suddenly, Elias's right hand stumbled. It was a tiny mistake, a microsecond where his finger slipped and hit a wrong note. It was a jarring sound in the middle of such beauty. Sterling flinched. He expected the boy to stop. He expected the spell to break. He expected the clumsy, nervous kid to return, but Elias didn't stop. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look down. In that split second, without missing a beat, he twisted the wrong note into the melody. He turned the mistake into a passing tone, a dissonance that made the next chord sound even sweeter. It was a trick that only a master musician could do, improvising on the spot to save the flow. The music kept going, seamless and perfect. Sterling let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He slumped back in his chair, staring at the boy. It wasn't just a fluke. It wasn't luck. This boy was a natural talent, a raw, unpolished diamond. The song was reaching its peak. The notes were cascading down the keyboard like a waterfall. Elias was playing with his whole body now. His head was bowed slightly, his dark hair falling over his forehead. His eyes were closed tight, blocking out the world, letting the music pour out of him. He wasn't playing to impress the director anymore. He was playing because he had to. The music was inside him, and it had to come out. He thought about his mother outside. He imagined she could hear him. He played for her. He played to tell her that everything was going to be okay. He played to tell her that her hard work was not wasted. He poured all his love into the final passage of the song, the notes rising higher and higher. Full of hope and light, the tension in the room was stretched tight like a rubber band. The judges were on the edge of their seats. Sterling was gripping the edge of the table so hard, his knuckles turned white. They were all waiting for the end, Holding their breath, suspended in the moment, Elias lifted his hands high. He played the final chord. It was a big, full sound, 3 notes that blended perfectly together, a C major chord, simple and strong. He held it, letting the sound ring out, filling the hall with one last, brilliant burst of music. Then, he brought his hands down to his lap. The sound faded into the silence, leaving a ghost of an echo hanging in the air. Elias sat there, his chest heaving slightly. He opened his eyes and blinked, adjusting to the bright lights of the room. He slowly came back to reality. He was just a kid on a bench again. His hands were trembling slightly from the effort. He looked down at his sneakers. He didn't dare look at the judges. He didn't know if they would hate it. He didn't know if they would laugh again. He only knew that he had played exactly what was in his heart. He had told his truth. The silence stretched on. It was heavy, but this time, it wasn't an angry silence. It was a shocked silence. The air in the room felt different now. It felt cleared out like the air after a thunderstorm. Elias waited. His heart started to beat fast again. He prepared himself to stand up and walk out, to leave the stage quietly and go find his mother. He thought his time was up, but then the silence was broken. For what felt like a very long time, nobody said a word. The sound of the piano had faded away completely, leaving the hall in a deep, heavy quiet. But it wasn't the same awkward silence from before. It was a charged silence, the kind you feel when everyone in the room is holding their breath at the same time. The air seemed to vibrate with the memory of the music that had just been played. Elias sat on the bench, his hands resting quietly in his lap. He could feel the sweat drying on his forehead, making his skin feel tight and cold. He kept his eyes fixed on the black and white keys. He was afraid to look up. In his mind, he was sure that Professor Sterling was about to yell at him. He thought the man would be angry that he hadn't played the music from the folder, or that he had wasted their time with his own song. Elias prepared himself for the sharp voice, for the insult that would send him running out of the room in shame. But the yell didn't come. Slowly, the sound of someone shuffling in a chair broke the quiet. It was the woman judge. She had taken her pen out of her mouth, and for the first time, she wasn't looking at her notebook. She was staring at Elias with her mouth slightly open, as if she had just seen a ghost. Then she looked over at the man with the beard, and her eyes were wide. "I didn't expect that," the man whispered. His voice was raspy, like he hadn't used it in a while. Professor Sterling was the only one who hadn't moved yet. He was still leaning forward, his elbows on the table, his hands covering the lower half of his face. He was staring at Elias, but his expression had changed completely. The look of boredom and arrogance was gone. In its place was a look of total confusion and deep concentration. He looked like a man who was trying to solve a math problem that didn't make sense, but he knew the answer was right in front of him. Elias couldn't stand the suspense anymore. He slowly lifted his head. He looked at Sterling, their eyes meeting for the first time since the music began. Sterling didn't look away. He slowly lowered his hands and placed them flat on the table. He didn't speak. He just looked at the boy, really looked at him, not just at the clothes or the messy hair, but at the person who had played that incredible song. The woman judge cleared her throat, a small, delicate sound. She turned her notebook to a fresh page and picked up her pen. "That was original," she said softly. "You improvised that entire piece?" Elias nodded, his throat feeling too tight to speak. He just gave a small, quick nod. "Do you know what you just played?" the man with the beard asked. He sounded genuinely curious. "Not mean at all. It's just something I play at home," Elias whispered. His voice sounded small in the big room. "I didn't memorize it for a test. I just felt it." Sterling finally shifted in his chair. He sat up straighter, smoothing down the front of his expensive jacket. He cleared his throat loudly. The sound was harsh and broke the spell that had fallen over the judges. "Standard procedure requires applicants to play a prepared classical piece," Sterling said. His voice was stiff and formal, but the edge was gone from it. He wasn't sneering anymore. He was speaking like a lawyer, sticking to the rules, but his eyes were soft. Elias felt his stomach drop. He messed up. He broke the rules. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, panic rising in his chest. I dropped the papers, and I forgot the notes on the page. I just played what was in my head. I'm sorry. He started to reach for the fallen sheet music on the floor, ready to gather his things and leave. He felt so foolish. He thought he had proven himself by playing well, but maybe he had only shown them that he couldn't follow instructions. Stop, Sterling said. The command wasn't angry. It was sharp, but it was meant to stop Elias from moving. Elias froze, his hand hovering in the air over the sheet music. Sterling stood up. This was unusual. The judges usually stayed seated while the student was on stage. Sterling walked around the long table and walked toward the piano. His footsteps echoed on the hard floor. He stopped a few feet away from Elias. I've been teaching here for 30 years, Sterling said. His voice was low, and he spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. In those 30 years, I have heard thousands of students play the piano. I have heard children who can play faster than you. I have heard children who have perfect pitch. I have heard children who can play pieces that are technically perfect. He paused and looked down at the boy. But in all that time, I have rarely heard someone play with that much honesty. Elias looked up at him, blinking in surprise. Honesty. Yes, Sterling said. Most students play to please me. They play to get a score. They play like robots. They play the notes, but they don't play the music. You didn't play the notes? You played the silence between them. You played your own heart. It was messy, and it was rough around the edges, but it was real. Sterling put his hands in his pockets and looked away for a moment, seeming a little bit embarrassed by his own words. He was a man who was used to being the boss, not a man who was used to complimenting children. When you hit that wrong note, Sterling continued, looking back at Elias, I winced. I thought it was over, but what you did next, you fixed it. You turned a mistake into part of the song. That is not something you can teach in a classroom. That is a gift. The woman judge stood up and walked over to stand beside Sterling. She smiled at Elias. It was a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes. It was beautiful, Elias, she said. You have a very special voice. Elias felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the stage lights. He looked from the woman to the man with the beard, who had also stood up and was nodding in agreement. For the first time in his life, Elias felt seen. He felt like his music mattered. He felt like he mattered. So, Elias said quietly, his voice shaking a little bit. Does that mean, do I pass? Sterling let out a short breath of air that sounded almost like a laugh. He looked at the other judges, then back at the boy. This program is for the best young musicians we can find, Sterling said sternly. It is difficult. It is demanding. It requires discipline. Do you think you can handle that? Do you think you can follow the rules and learn the hard stuff, not just the fun stuff? Elias thought about his mother. He thought about the long bus rides, the tired nights, and the worn-out keys on his piano at home. He thought about how much he wanted to learn, to get better, to be able to play the music he heard in his head. Yes, sir, Elias said, his voice gaining strength. I can work hard. I promise I can work hard. Sterling nodded. He looked at the boy's shoes, then up at his face. I believe you. We will talk about the paperwork later. But for now, Sterling didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He gave Elias a small, curt nod, a sign of respect that meant more than any applause could. Then he turned and began to walk back to his seat. But before he sat down, a sound came from the back of the hall. The door to the waiting room was cracked open just an inch. A person was standing there, listening. It was a girl from the waiting line, maybe a year older than Elias. She had her violin case slung over her shoulder. She had heard the music through the door. She pushed the door open a little wider and poked her head in. She wasn't supposed to be in the auditorium, but she didn't care. She looked at Elias, sitting there on the big bench, looking small but proud. She didn't say anything. She just smiled and gave him a thumbs dash up. Then a single person began to clap. It was the woman judge. She clapped slowly, deliberately. Then the man with the beard joined in, and then Professor Sterling stood by his chair, and without a word, he began to clap, too. It wasn't a loud thunder of noise yet. It was just a steady, rhythmic clapping that filled the quiet hall. But to Elias, it sounded like the loudest, most wonderful sound in the world. He sat up straighter, a small smile finally breaking across his face. He had done it. He had played. And for the first time, the world was listening. The sound of the judge's clapping was still ringing in Elias's ears as he pushed the heavy door open and stepped out of the rehearsal hall. The air in the hallway felt cooler, fresher than the stale, tense air of the audition room. His legs felt a little wobbly, like jelly, but it was a good feeling. It was the feeling you get after you run a very long race. He stopped for a moment near the wall to catch his breath. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling slightly, but now he knew it wasn't just fear. It was the leftover energy from the music. He looked at his sneakers, one of which was untied. He didn't care. He felt like he was floating an inch off the ground. The long hallway that had seemed so scary, when he walked in, looked completely different now. The fluorescent lights didn't seem as harsh. The floor didn't seem as slippery. Even the photos of the past award winners on the walls didn't look like they were judging him anymore. They just looked like people who had once stood where he stood. He walked toward the exit at the end of the hall. As he got closer to the waiting area, he could hear the low buzz of voices again. The other students were still there. They were talking, laughing, and tuning their instruments. Just 20 minutes ago, Elias had been terrified of them. He had felt like he didn't belong, like a fake in a world of real artists. But as he walked into the waiting room, the atmosphere shifted. The girl with the cello looked up first. She stopped sawing at her instrument. She recognized him as the boy who had gone in with the messy papers. The boy with the shiny trumpet turned around too. There was a hush that fell over the group, similar to the one in the hall, but this one was filled with curiosity. They were waiting to see if he had failed miserably. Elias didn't look at the floor this time. He didn't pull his sleeves down over his hands. He walked with his head up, clutching his worn folder to his chest. He walked past them, and for the first time, didn't feel invisible. He pushed the glass door that led outside and stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight. The sun was warm on his face, and he closed his eyes for a second, letting it warm his skin. The sounds of the city cars honking, people talking, the distant hum of traffic welcomed him back to the real world. He scanned the benches outside the building. There were people sitting everywhere, reading newspapers, talking on phones, eating lunch. He looked to the left, near a large oak tree, and there she was, his mother. She was sitting on the edge of a concrete bench, clutching her purse in her lap. She looked smaller than usual. Her shoulders were slumped forward, and she was staring at her shoes. She looked tired. The long wait had clearly been hard on her. She looked like a woman who was preparing herself for bad news. She looked like she was ready to hug her son and tell him it was okay, that they would try again next year. Even though they both knew there wouldn't be money for next year, Elias felt a sudden pang in his heart. He realized that while he was playing the music of his life, she was sitting out here, living in the fear of his failure. She had carried the weight of their family's struggle on her shoulders while he was on stage. He started walking toward her. He didn't run. He walked slowly. She must have sensed him coming. She lifted her head and turned. When she saw Elias, her face lit up with a hopeful, nervous smile. She stood up immediately, smoothing down her skirt. She looked at his face, searching for a sign. Elias stopped in front of her. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her. He saw the worry lines around her eyes. He saw the old coat she was wearing. He saw the love that she gave him every single day. He held up the folder. It was still bent and frayed, but inside it, he now had something that made it worth a fortune. They liked it, she whispered. Her voice was shaking. Did you play? Elias nodded. I played, Mom, and... She held her breath. She was terrified to ask the question. Elias took a deep breath. He looked her straight in the eyes. I messed up the papers. I dropped them. The director was mean at first. His mother's face fell a little. She reached out to touch his arm, ready to comfort him. But then, Elias continued, his voice getting stronger, I played our song. The one I play at home. She blinked. Our song? Yes, and Mom. The director stood up. He clapped. They all clapped. Silence between them stretched out for a second. His mother stared at him. She couldn't believe it. She processed the words. Asterisk, he clapped. They all clapped. Asterisk, then, a sound escaped her throat. It was a mix of a laugh and a sob. She grabbed Elias and pulled him into a hug so tight he could barely breathe. She didn't care that they were in public. She didn't care who was watching. She buried her face in his shoulder, holding on to him as if he were the most precious thing in the world. I knew it, she whispered into his ear, her voice thick with tears. I always knew you could do it. I told you. I told you you were special. Elias hugged her back. He buried his face in the smell of her coat, which smelled like fabric softener in the diner. It was the best smell in the world. I got in, Mom, he said. I really got in. They stood there for a long time, just holding on to each other on the sidewalk. People walked past them, rushing to their own lives, glancing at the woman and the boy in the big blazer. But they didn't care. They were in their own little world of victory. When they finally pulled apart, his mother wiped her eyes with a crumpled tissue from her pocket. She laughed, a happy, relieving sound. Okay, she said, sniffing. Okay, we have to go home. We have to tell everyone. We have to call Grandma. She took his hand, something she hadn't done in a long time because he was getting too old for it. But today, Elias didn't pull away. He held her hand tight. As they turned to walk toward the bus stop, Elias looked back at the university building one last time. It was tall and imposing, made of brick and stone. It looked like a fortress of knowledge and power. It still looked scary a little bit. It still looked hard, but it didn't look impossible anymore. He saw a window on the second floor, near where the rehearsal hall was. He imagined Professor Sterling inside, maybe sitting at his desk. Maybe thinking about the boy who played the wrong notes, but made the right music. He hoped the director was thinking about it. Elias turned back to his mother. She was swinging his hand a little bit as they walked, a spring in her step that hadn't been there that morning. How was the bus ride here? She asked him, smiling down at him. It was long, Elias said, but it was worth it. Yes, she said, squeezing his hand. It was worth it. They walked down the busy sidewalk, moving with the flow of the crowd. Elias felt the folder under his arm. It was just paper and cardboard, but it was heavier now. It was filled with promise. He thought about the piano at home. He thought about the sticky keys and the wobbly leg. He realized he didn't need a grand piano to make music. He just needed what was inside him. The sun was starting to go down, casting long shadows across the street. The city was lighting up, street lamps flickering on. It was a normal Tuesday evening for everyone else. But for Elias, it was the first evening of the rest of his life. He wasn't just the kid in the hand-me-down clothes anymore. He was a musician, and he knew that no matter what door he walked through next time, he would always be able to find the music inside the silence. He walked a little taller, matching his mother's step, ready for the long bus ride home.